Hello, I'm the Pink Phantom, and this is my podcast. Join me as I delve into the world of games and gaming, and especially old school RPGs. Together, let's voyage into the astral realm and check out my Phantom thoughts. Hello again, everyone. Those of you who are listening to this podcast as you're perusing my back catalog will not notice any different, but those of you who are whose current one-to-one time is coincidental with how I am posting my podcast will have noticed a 2-week hiatus for no apparent reason. That's the actual truth. There's no apparent reason for it. It just kind of happened. It wasn't even that I was that busy or anything. I just didn't podcast. But for those of you who have stayed with me, thank you. Those who are just joining, thank you. Those of you who are perusing my back catalog, thank you. On this episode, I've got calls from Riley from the Diegetic Advancement podcast, Evil Jeff from the Minions and Musings podcast, Jason from the Nerds RPG Variety Cast, and Anthony from the Casting Shadows podcast. They are all responding to my question from my previous podcast. How much do the rules of RPGs matter? Are there rules that will always matter, that must be set hardcore and followed? Well, maybe not hardcore, but must be set and followed to play a particular RPG correctly. How much are they mutable? How much are they changeable? How much does the concept of OSRs, ruling over rules, factor into how you play, and whether you play rules as written or adjust them as you go or simply replace them as you go? What about breaking rules down into different sets, the way the boxed sets of D&D were broken down in the 1980s? Does it help to have starter sets? Does it help to have an advanced game, a basic game, an advanced game, or where different segments of the game are categorized and put together so that there's definitely a place where you start and then a place where you come play next and then next. And there's a whole variety of opinions here, which is exactly what I was hoping for when I asked the question. And I'm not going to respond to each one because there's really not a right or wrong here. And it's just a case of people stating what they see as how important the rules are, how important having specific rules are, how important just having a good rule set is, how important it is simply to be consistent. And those are the themes that you're going to hear in these calls. And I do have a couple of notes that I'll add at the end. And then after the calls, we'll return to my solo AD&D campaign, Tales of the Dragon Slayers. It's been a while since I last did a catch-up episode or this has been the story thus far episode, and that's what you're going to hear here today. So if you're new to the podcast and you're just picking it up and you maybe have heard a few previous episodes and you're kind of lost as to what's going on, this is a good place to kind of catch up with the general idea of what's been going on in that campaign. So without further ado, I'm going to get to the calls.
Hey, Riley here. I've been slacking on some calls, so you've put a few shows out before I could actually get a call in. Just wanted to say, really enjoying the shows, interesting topics, and the solo play is great. On simple versus complex games, as Jason says, it's a hard thing to actually nail down, but you probably know it when you see it. I think you could have some sort of equation to work it out. Things like page count, layout, editing, or clearness of text, number of resolution mechanics, the complexity of that, number and complexity of player options, number and complexity of rules exceptions, and so on. It'd be very long, which kind of reinforces the point. There is probably a sweet spot, not too few rules and not too many. A great point on the cognitive load of D100s. I think exceptions are a big issue with making games complicated. If it's always kind of the same thing and it just always works the same way, it's much easier to internalize that. As for box sets or splitting your game up, I think it depends. Much like what I think of starter sets, if the price and the content is right, then I think it's good. For this, the BECME or the BX model is pretty good. There's a logical split. There's enough game in each book to be a full or complete game. Even 5e is a good example of this. You can play a lot of the game for free. Pick up the free basic SRD, and you've got a bunch of game there, and you can pick up more content or rules as you need them. Get the player's handbook, monster manual, TMG, which of course segues into your later show pretty well. Should your game evolve over time? Yeah, totally. It should evolve with the campaign, the players, and with experience. Basic is a great game, but does it let you, manage domains, wage large wars, or go on plane hopping adventures to fight gods? No, you're going to need to evolve your rules to handle these things, and I don't think it needs to be backwards compatible either. And of course, once you've learnt, you take all those learnings from that campaign, and the next time you go back to play basic, you implement them. It won't be the same basic. Anyway, enjoying the shows. Keep it up. Talk to you later.
Phantom, it's Evil Jeff. So, how important are rules? Well, I'm going to say they're very important. The rules in any given game allow us to have a mechanism for a repeatable experience of knowing who the winners and who the losers are. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, RPGs, there are no winners and losers. In the overall scheme, that may be the case, but when you break it down to the individual parts, there are winners and losers. Are you going to sit here and tell me that there are no winners and losers in combat? Then why fight monsters at all? Oh, well, you don't have to fight. Well, you could trick them. Well, in the goal to get their gold or something. So the rules are there to govern that interaction of the players versus monsters, NPCs, whatever. That's why we have those rules. And it's a repeatable thing that the outcome is going to be known. It can be predicted. Oh, wait a minute. Predicted? Yeah. Doesn't matter how random the roll is. Yes, the roll can go anywhere between, whatever, 1 to 20, 1 to 6, 1 to 10, 1 to 100. But the rules are still there going, in this case of combat, if the die roll plus, positives, or in addition to all modifiers, equals or is greater than a target number, the player hits. Otherwise, the player misses. And it's predictable, and they can see what the outcome is going to be. Yes, there's a random roll in there, and we're guessing, but the outcome is not going to be, random. It's predictable. Got to hit a certain number. And same thing with any skill check, etc., like that. So yeah, the rules are very important. I think when there's a lot of subjectivity, then that's where some players may not like it. Back in our wargaming roots, there were very definitive things, but it still came down to, in some cases, the referee or judge or whatever is the final arbiter, and that they decide what the outcome of some thing is going to be. And it was based upon their thoughts. And there are going to be people out there that all it has to do is go against them one time, and they think that the whole world is out to get them. They never get anywhere, and there's just a lot of negativity. And that's why, having these rules help clarify things so that a predictable outcome can be had. Do we have to have rules for every situation? That makes it sound like we're playing 5e or something, or 3e or 4e, whatever. Having a lot of rules in there, being rules heavy. But if you do not want to have any doubt as to what the outcome will be, then you play those with as many rules as possible to govern all potential situations. So yeah, they're important. I think equally important is how many rules a gaming group willingly says they're going to use or allow the GM to use. And if some of that means that there is situations that are not covered by the rules, then hopefully they're abiding by the one rule of the GM, judge, adjudicator, is the final arbiter of the situation. Great stuff. Hope we hear some more from you.
Hey, Pink Phantom, Jason here. Listen to episode 95. And just really quickly on the idea of the box sets and the starter sets, or, the progression of sets. Honestly, I still like the other TSR games. I like having the basic rules and the advanced rules in the same book. And the reason is, so the first 20 pages of the book are the basic rules and the rest of the book are the advanced rules or whatever. And the reason is, I started on BECME. BECME was the D&D I started on and then moved on to AD&D. And the issue with BECME is there's no easy way to combine all those rules without having to look through, 4 or 5 different rule books to figure out what you're doing, right? So once you have all those rules and now you're trying to play with all the rules and they're spread across 4 or 5 books, that's a real pain in the butt. And mind you, that's part of the issue with AD&D is you have to flip and turn through different books too. But, I'll come back to in a second. But so for me, and I know the Rules Cyclopedia kind of fixed that, although the Rules Cyclopedia came out well after I had left playing with those games, so I never had it back in the day. But even if you do those separate box sets like TSR did, it can, and we see that even with BX, right? So even with BX, there are some rules in the expert set that aren't in the basic set that get skipped and missed by people because they're having to go through different books. Now that's one advantage of OSE, and often I don't give OSE the credit it probably deserves, but OSE, at least by combining base and expert together, have all the rules together. So there's that. But yeah, I think having everything in one book is huge because it's so easy to miss something if you have 3 books to look through to try to find a rule. Now, going back to AD&D and going to your discussion of how important are rules, when we look at people that have played with them back in the day and we look at these people talking about this today, what we're hearing from people like EOTB are things like, you read through the rules, and the intent is to internalize rules enough to make calls when you're playing the game. So the intent isn't really to flip and turn through the books. The intent's not to look up every table. Like for overbearing, the intent's to have a guesstimate. So instead of adding up all the weights, you have maybe 3 basic values you use and just move forward. The intent for the morale stuff is to make a judgment call on the modifier and move forward, right? Because you have to keep the game rolling forward, keep it moving. And Gary talks about that in D&G. So even with AD&D, how important are the rules? Well, they're guidelines, right? And I think RPGs are different than other games in that sense. Where having consistent rules in RPGs are important are things like conventions and tournaments, and where you're meeting people you've never played with before and you're playing a 4-hour game, so you kind of need consistent rules so everybody's on the same sheet of music. And especially for like tournaments or shared play, adventure leagues, things like that, you really do need some codified rules so it all makes sense. But at individual tables, yeah, I mean, we know that Gary didn't play with the rules in AD&D. It's, and it's silly to argue. I guess I don't, there's an academic interest in, hey, this is how they played in 1975. But as much as I'm into that to some degree, and I like trying to play games rules as written, or to the spirit of rules as written, honestly, you're not going to recreate the 1975 game experience because it's not 1975. You know what I mean? There are a lot of things I liked from back in the day, but honestly, drinking and driving and smoking and some of these other things that were really normal back then, and some of the, we probably don't want to be doing that right now, right? And, some of the terms we used and some of the humor, doesn't fit in today's world. So, and I'm not talking about the games now, and I'm not putting down game designers, but I'm just saying, the good old days weren't always that good, right? So there are not advances, that's the wrong word. Anyway, it's interesting how they played back then, and it's definitely, from an academic sense, interesting to try it, but I don't need to be stuck in 1975 in how I play a game, if that makes sense. Now, obviously, some games, you do have set rules, like chess, right? We don't modify chess depending on the table we're sitting at, But role-playing games aren't like that. They're a different kind of entertainment. And now you ask about what rules are immutable, what rules shouldn't we change? And maybe that depends on the group, and maybe it depends on the game, honestly. Honestly, for me, the big thing about role-playing games are you should have a randomizer in there. It shouldn't just be, yes, you pass, no, you fail. There should be a randomizer in there for those uncertain times. So I think you need to have a randomizer in there. I think outside of metacurrency, that randomizer role should probably stand for important decisions. But if you have metacurrency, maybe not. Maybe then you can modify it. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what those immutable rules are, honestly. I think the immutable rules are don't be a dick and have everybody at the table agree to the rules. Have fun. Again, I know we're not getting a lot of feedback from here. I don't know if that's because of Gary Con and this other stuff, other things going on, but hopefully we get some more feedback. But yeah, I am curious what people think the hard, fast rules you have to have in a role-playing game are. Okay, I've talked way too long. Sorry. Let you go. If I can hang up.
Pink Phantom. It's Anthony calling in from the Casting Shadows podcast and the Endless Road. Just listening to your question or your ponderings, your phantom thoughts about how or why does it matter that a particular game is played with the correct interpretation and the correct arrangement of rules from a specific point in time. How important is it, or why is it important to play the way that so-and-so played at such and such a time? And, like you, I don't think I have it in me to have an answer for that particular one. I think maybe that feeling is driven by interests or preferences that I don't share. But, I don't know, maybe I have some insight into it. Some games that I like to play that have seen a lot of, have seen change, let's put it that way, over the decades that I've been playing them are Battletech and Starfleet Battles. And some rules changes, like in the case of Battletech, don't change how you play, per se, but they completely change the feel of the game, they change the context of the game, they change, the mechs have completely changed, the politics have completely changed. There's a tremendous amount of change in that game from where it started to where it is now, while keeping the rules greatly expanded but relatively the same. But if you were to plop someone who played Battletech once or twice in the 80s and gave them the current Battletech, there would be some surprise. Right? And you might get a lot of those stories where, like, back in my day, mechs couldn't do all of this, and they didn't have all of this protection, and they didn't carry all of this firepower, and they couldn't move this fast. The game has completely changed, and maybe that changes your tactics, and maybe that changes your feelings, and that kind of stuff. With Starfleet battles, there are a lot of knock-on effects. If how a particular unit or how a particular weapon system or defensive system operates changes in some way, it has these large, expansive effects. Well, that doesn't happen often, but that was interesting. We just got passed by a whole bunch of guys on sport bikes, and I know where they're headed. There's a curious version of a biker bar not far from here, where they serve coffee and you sit in comfortable chairs and look out large windows at your bike. But sometimes in a war game, what looks like a small change has tremendous effects in how everybody else has to play from that point on. So I think if we look at it from that perspective, we can gain a little insight into people wanting to play the game as it existed at a certain point in time to see how well they would do, or just feel what it was like. In my own experience in martial arts, there came a point in time where I really wanted to have a sword from the period from which my techniques are drawn. I wanted to know the difference between how modern steel behaves and how period steel might have behaved, and if there were things that I do now that would have been foolhardy then because of the equipment, and if the equipment from then would give insight into the things that are less clear, if that makes sense. The relative durability, the relative flexibility, the ability to hold an edge, what sort of edge, the weight distribution, you get the point. What does it tell you? What does it teach you when you get to shift your perspective to a different point along the timeline of development? And maybe that is what people are looking for. I don't know. But just as a final thought, in my own play, I play a lot of games where a strong genre is important, like a pulp heroics game or a horror game and that sort of thing. And well, the games do change radically if you take something out or change how something operates, such as a horror mechanic, or playing with or without mook rules or minions rules in a pulp game, where every fight becomes a fight to the death rather than a solid blow to the chin to knock out this evildoer, that kind of stuff. So we know that system matters. You said at the beginning that we know that system matters. But in this particular instance, how does system matter? I think is a really good question. Thanks for asking.
So as promised, a lot of goodness from a lot of very smart people who have been playing RPGs and talking about RPGs and looking at RPGs for a long time, both individually and combined. Thank you guys so much for calling in. All of them, their podcasts are linked in the show notes of this episode. I advise you to give them a listen. As of the recording of this episode, Jason has announced the Nerds RPG Variety Cast is going to be winding down over the next month or so, but he does have well over 500 episodes, and there's a lot of goodness there. So I certainly advise you to look into that and to all of their episodes. There's some really good discussions, some really neat ideas, some really intriguing things that they have done in terms of prep for their own games, prep for games they're participating in, games they've played, wrap-ups, just wrap-ups of play of things that they've done. Jason is doing a solo campaign himself. He's doing that on his blog. That is linked in the show notes as well. So please check that out. And again, I thank all these guys for their feedback. I love feedback. I got into podcasting as part of the Anchorite community, an old app that you used to be able to have on your phone where you could easily record and edit and post, and there was a button where people could push that button and leave you a short message about your your podcast. It was a great interactive system, and that was kind of what I built this podcast around a little bit, of encouraging that kind of feedback. So if you want to have feedback, those links are in the show notes. They're also at the end of the show. And please let me hear from you. Even if you don't want to be played on the podcast or read out on the podcast, that's fine. Just let me know. And but I would gladly take any kind of feedback or interaction you would care to give me. That being said, rules. How important are the rules? I keep going back to muster, and I guess this is because I kept going through it over and over again over several months as I was covering it in this podcast, and I keep coming back to a part of that book where the author talked about, first you decide what your campaign is going to be about, and then you pick a rule set that lets you play that out. What is it you're trying to be? Is it trying to be high fantasy adventure? Are you trying to be Indiana Jones style pulp? Are you looking to be street level superhero? Are you looking to be cosmic level superhero? Are you looking to be hard sci-fi? Are you looking to be science fantasy, something along the lines of Star Wars? You decide that first, because the play centers around the campaign, and that's where you start. And then the author does talk about, since his book is about playing D&D the wargaming way, that is what he is interested in. That is what he is interested in simulating, is the term that he uses. He does list the things that he considers to be important to be playing D&D in a wargaming way. And that's mainly using some kind of hit points, using some kind of a hit die system where a first level character can be felled essentially by one hit from a weapon that does one hit die worth of damage, where there are experience levels, and where the survivability of the character grows faster with level advancement than the ability of creatures to do damage to them goes as you advance them up that damage track. And that, coupled with the OSR notion of rulings over rules and some of the related concepts in NSR and some OSR thinking about rules light, not having a heavy cognitive load of rules essentially, and utilizing rulings to fill those gaps, has maybe colored the way that I look at this concept of how important the rules are. That there is a base that you need to be true to get the feel of the adventure that you're wanting to have, the world you're wanting to inhabit, for lack of a better term. But after that, you adjust it to keep the campaign in that same mind space that you were looking to occupy all along, the experience you were looking to have. And that may mean adjusting rules in a given rule set, changing rules in a given rule set, or creating rules, or really rulings on the spot to fill in a gap that maybe that rule set doesn't have, that doesn't create the feel that you want, or simply something the author of the rule set didn't foresee. And I wanted to make it clear I was saying rulings there, because the author also says that, and this is something that is different from what I usually hear when talking about the idea of rulings versus rules. Generally, the idea is that the rulings kind of stack. You remember from session to session throughout the campaign, throughout the adventure, throughout your playing group, how you adjudicated a certain situation, and you always adjudicate it that way. But the author of Muster says you are not compelled to do that, that each instance that you make a ruling is unique unto itself, and that the idea is to be true to the genre emulation or the immersion that you're seeking, and that is the priority above the same ruling every time. And really, that concept, I think, is what really drove the question, the idea of how far afield can you go from established rules and established rulings before you have changed completely. And the notion that a lot of the callers had was that if you're true to the rule set, that the rule set serves as kind of an anchor to what you're trying to accomplish. It's the anchor that keeps things consistent. It's the anchor that, in the words of Evil Jeff, keep things predictable. And I think that the difference in the way the author of Muster puts forward the concept is that the notion of consistency and predictability is not based on keeping to the same rules and keeping to the same rulings, but having in your mind's eye what it is you're trying to experience. And as long as you, and by you I mean not just you as an individual, but the group that you're playing with, is getting the experience that they want, then the exact content of the rules and rulings does not matter as much. But then, again, on the other side, that same author says, these are the things that define a game of D&D that you play the wargaming way. So it's an interesting push-pull that at one end you have the rule set, which is what you start with. At the other end, you have the experience, which is really where you end up. And where does the consistency lie? And the idea in a lot of cases is if you have consistency at the start, you will always have consistency within. But with the author, the notion is that everything starts with the campaign. It starts before you get to the rule set. So the rule set and the rulings are in that middle, and that middle is variable. Again, to an extent, he does express these are things that you have to have D&D the wargaming way. So it's an interesting concept, and I'm not sure I've explained it the way that my brain is explaining it to me, but I think it's an interesting idea that the rules and rulings are the middle part, whereas the concept and the experience are the end parts, and those are the important points. And the middle is just how you get there. And that may not be the same path every time. It is possible to start doing things one way and then find a better way as you're doing it. Kind of like when you go to work or you go to the place you shop most often and you have a path you follow, and then one day you have to detour for some reason and you end up finding a different way. And maybe you find out it's a better way. So that's my 2 cents on the subject. I hope you've enjoyed listening to that. I hope you enjoyed listening to Riley and Anthony and Evil Jeff and Jason and their thoughts on it. It was definitely a great conversation, and I hope more people will participate, whether they're listening to my show in real time, for lack of a better term, or listening days, weeks, months, years into the future from now when I'm recording this. And with that, I'm going to wrap up this segment. And now, more from my solo AD&D RPG campaign, Tales of the Dragon Slayers. As spring bloomed in the 10th year of the reign of His Most Royal Highness, King Hexold, 6th of his name, in the northern realm, beyond the great pass through the God's Realm Mountains, the great red dragon, Baxenture, invaded the realm. First seizing the lair of the gold dragon Chalaton, the winged beast established its hoard, and then began laying waste of the local environs. Expeditions of soldiers and adventurers rallied against the creatures, but ended in failure, or, more often, never returned. This culminated after 4 10-days in a desperate battle at Fort Etchark, as the remaining forces of the kingdom barely repelled the beast. A 10-day later, a small party under the leadership of the cleric paladin, Sir Gus of the Bailey at Barnum, arrived at the fort and, despite warnings, sallied off in search of Baxenture. The party also consisted of the half-elf cleric fighter magic user Katya Rasputin, elven fighter magic user thief Bernie Keebler, fighter Sven Svensson, fighter druid Edgar Greystoke, fighter magic user Cudgel the Mighty, and Gus's longbowmen men-at-arms Harl and Quinn. After 10 days of searching, the party surprised the dragon in its lair and lured it out into a trap. After a hard-fought battle, the group prevailed, though at the end, Bernie and Sven lay dead, and Katya and Cudgel barely escaped with their lives. The party searched for a suitable place to store the dragon's treasure, but finding none nearby, settled on a vast former keep they had partially explored, 3 days away with a laden wagon. Over the course of moving the loot, they discovered a ring of wishes with which they restored Bernie and Sven and made friends with a war band of dwarves. As time went by, they began encountering ogres, orcs, and other beasts returning to the area now that the dragon was no longer seen in the skies. Gus and Katya returned to the fort for more supplies, and for Gus to send a message to his family, seeking soldiers to help protect the wealth they had obtained, and also to protect the King's Road, the price of taking possession of the keep as arranged through the fort's commander. Katya remained behind for training, and Gus passed the site of a great battle along the road. Returning to the dragon's lair, the party discussed the possible need of leaving behind some of the treasure and occupying the keep to stay off the roads until their support arrived, a decision swayed by the arrival of an entire tribe of orcs that came to the dragon's cave only to be wiped out by a tornado, and a group of hungry hill giants demanding food. They arrived at the keep just as the advance party of summoned troops was encamping there. They immediately began the process of cleaning out their new home and base of operations. As they did so, they encountered dwarves of the same clan they'd met before, gnomes, bandits, berserkers, giant ants, and many other creatures. They also found other adventuring parties, including a paladin named Prier and a fighter named Michael, who joined them. Unfortunately, Prier was stripped of his paladinhood by a magic pool. Eventually, Katya returned with the rest of their troops, and clerics and a magic user to aid in releasing Cudgel from the sway of a cursed ring. And just in time, as another tribe of orcs attacked the keep, but was routed. Soon thereafter, Prier and Cudgel left with the clerics and magic user for the fort, and Gus and Edgar departed with a portion of their force as part of an expedition to dislodge a group of gnolls from another keep further down the King's Road. The gnolls had assembled a vast coalition of humanoids which had stopped a heavily armed merchant caravan from getting through. Though the coalition was broken in the process, they had recently acquired the aid of some Ettins just before the party's force, along with a few nomads and troops from the fort, arrived. Still, the forces of law were triumphant, and the gnolls and Ettins either killed or captured. Meanwhile, the rest of the party continued exploring the keep. They found that the queen of the giant ants had become intelligent and psionically enhanced. She made a deal for the party to spare her, and she would provide them with scents to placate any ants they met and induce them to return to her. The party also found evidence of laboratories and observatories in the upper portion of the hill that the keep occupied. The group with Cudgel and Prier ran afoul of a group of werewolves just before reaching the fort. Prier and one of the clerics were killed, and Cudgel was felled before the magic user made good an escape with him. But 2 days later, a random wish by Katya brought Prier back to life. As Gus and Edgar return and Prier journeys back to the keep, the remaining party members continue to explore their new home, and the world continues to turn. The opening music of this podcast is Strength of the Titans, and the closing music is Late Night Radio, both by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. Thank you for listening to Phantom Thoughts. I would love to hear your feedback. You don't have to be part of the show. If you want to contact me and let me know, hey, these are for your eyes only. I just wanted to give you thoughts, ideas, response, and it's really for your eyes or ears only. That's absolutely fine. I'd love to hear from you either way. So just let me know when you contact me. I don't want to be part of the show. There are lots of different ways you can contact me. You can send me an email at phantomthoughtspodcast@gmail.com. And that can be a regular email, or you can attach an audio file to it. You can use the message button on my podcast site on podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/phantom thoughts. You can contact me via my Google Voice number, 864-209-1441. You can contact me via SpeakPipe at www.speakpipe.com/phantom thoughts. You can contact me on Discord, The Pink Phantom. All this contact information is listed in the show notes of every episode. And thank you for those who call in. Thank you for those who don't call in. I appreciate you listening and hope you'll listen again next time. Until then, I hope you have a great day.